hi everybody, how are you today? It's an incredible honor to be here and to give my first talk at DjangoCon. And like my coworker Nicole used to say, I might look nervous, but don't worry, it's just because I am. Okay. So let's say you want to buy a piece of art. I never bought famous art, but I suppose you should go to an art dealer. Okay. So you talk to your person, and they show you a painting from a famous artist. And it's really expensive. And you don't want to put so much money in something that you're not sure it's true or not. So you start making questions. Who owns it? Who made it? And how can you prove? And then your art dealer starts showing you documents that proves the painting provenance. So it was bought from somebody a couple years ago. Before that, it was exposed in this famous museum. It was found at some point. Because it was declared lost many years ago. Because the painter sold to somebody that didn't care that much about art. And then, voila, here's the actual Instagram post by Salvador Dalí bragging about the persistence of memory. So, what we just did, or kind of, was to get the provenance of a piece of art. This is the chronology of the ownership of a historical object. And it takes into account many different attributes to prove the provenance, the authenticity of a piece of art. Things like who was the artist, when and where the painting was made, how it was made, and where it was exhibited. And so authentication is not something only related to digital. In fact, there are different types of authentication, and we can take a look on them next. So in this talk, we'll cover authentication types and factors, the authenticate function, authentication backends, login, logout, and sessions. But first, my name is Renato Oliveira, and I'm from the city here, Recife, probably not the first one that you saw here. It's an always sunny city in Brazilian Northeast, and you should go there if you want to take vacations. And I'm a co-founder at LabCodes, and my day job is basically to complain that I'm not coding as much as I would like. And I've organized a few conferences in Brazil, from local meetups to even a Brazilian PyCon. And I know how hard it is to put together a conference like this, so I'd like to thank the organizing team for that. And I'm a proud member of the Python user group from my state, and I've been working with Django for almost a decade. A little about LabCodes. We're a software studio based in Brazil, and we specialize in creating custom web products fitted for specific needs. We believe that software should be built by fulfilling clients' and user expectations, and our software is always aimed at solving problems and optimizing process. It's an honor for me and for the team to be here speaking and sponsoring. And I'll be here through all the sprints, and I'm more than happy to talk about what we do. And like I said before, I worked with Django for almost a decade. And I've created my share of authentication systems. Single sign-ons, custom authentication. I've integrated with many third-party apps through Auth, Auth2, and others. And every time I need to do something different, I need to research all over again. So, authentication is not something like storing a record in a database, using a template tag, or creating an API endpoint. We usually do that once per project. And if you work for the same company, in the same project since you've learned how to Django, the chance that you implement it once or never are high. So hopefully this talk will help us to remember it in the future. And a little disclaimer here, I'll show some code because it's a deep dive talk, but I've cut some things off to try to be more direct to the point. So, authentication is the process or action of providing or showing something to be true, genuine, or valid. And like we just saw, it's not something only related to computers. In fact, there are 3 types of authentication. The first type is accepting the proof of identity by a credible entity. It can be a witness, a reliable friend, or our certificate authority. Here, the authentication is implied. So for example, a product being sold by a known vendor implies authenticity, but even though they are not aware of all steps of the supply chain. The second one is comparing the object attributes with known attributes from that origin. Kind of the duck typing of authentication. And like an art expert might look at painting style, location, and form of the signature. Also, BIOS authentication is done by comparing attributes. The third type relies on external affirmations or documentation, like a password stored in the database, or even my passport. Some products, like medicines, they need to take all three types of authentication to prevent counterfeit. So, when talking about electronic authentication, we can use different factors to establish digital identity. And there are three categories of authentication factors, and they are generally broken down as. So, knowledge factors is something that the user knows, like a username or password. Possession factors is something that the user owns, like a smart card or security token or a mobile device. And inherence or biometric factors, it's something that the user is, like a fingerprint, a voice, or iris pattern. Single-factor authentication is based in only one category. The most common single-factor authentication method we have is the combination of username and password. It's something that the user knows. But for more critical systems containing sensitive data, it's important to add additional factors to establish the security. So multiple factor authentication involves two or more independent credentials for more secure transactions. OK, single-factor authentication, username, password, is the most common type of authentication we have out there, and we are at a Django conference, so let's see how Django does that. Django comes by default with an authentication system. The configuration required is already there on our settings.py, generated by the Start project. We need three apps: Auth, content types and sessions, and two middlewares: session middleware and authentication middleware. The content types is used to allow permissions to be binded, to be associated with any model you create. And the Auth and sessions contain the core of the authentication session framework. The main functionality of any authentication system is to let the user in, is to verify the user identity. So that's our entry point, the authentication function. What this function does is to iterate over a list of authentication backends, tries to authenticate the user with the credentials provided, and if any of the backends says that this user is denied, it stops attempting. But if the user is authenticated, it will return the user. This function is the core of the authentication system in Django, but we ended up adding another concept here, the authentication backends. This is the API provided by Django to enable multiple sources of authentication. Maybe your company is trying to create a single sign-on, or you're trying to authenticate into another system with Auth 2. The API is the same. You have to create an authentication backend, defining authenticate and get user methods, a few other stuff, register on your settings, and let Django do the rest. By default, Django comes with an authentication backend, actually two, but it uses one. By default, it's the model backend, which is the implementation of the default single-factor authentication in Django. So it gets the username and password, gets the user, and checks their password, and also if the user can authenticate. There's a hack here, a nice one. So the time of the response of trying to authenticate into an existent user was different than a non-existent one, because the check password hashes the password and takes some time to do that. So it was easier to attackers to discover which users are actually in the database. So this set password on the user model was added to add some response time. So we just verified our user identity using a single-factor authentication. But we need to remember that we're over HTTP, which is stateless. So it doesn't carry information between requests. So we need a way to know that the user already proved their identity and we don't need to ask again on every request. This is where login sessions enter. Just a moment. So, login is the process to gain access to a system by identifying and authenticating. We already did that with the user, so we need a way to know that the user is already authenticated, and we don't need to ask over and over again. So the login function, it takes the authenticated user and persists it into the request. It also uses the session framework to store the user primary key and can be accessed on every request using the session key. So after the login is executed, the user can access the login required resource without needing to provide their credentials again. Logout basically undoes login job. It flushes the user session and changes back the user in the request to an anonymous user, like we can see on this code. And like I said before, HTTP is stateless, which means that the messages between client and server are completely independent from each other. There is no sequence or behavior between requests. So if you want to keep track of your user actions, you need another way to manage that. Session is a temporary and interactive information interchange between two or more communicating devices, or a computer and a user. It's a mechanism that lets you store arbitrary data per browser and have that data available whenever the browser connects again. So we could store all that data in cookies or URL parameters. In fact, they are very handy in some cases. Let's imagine a hotel aggregator service. To find a place, you need to put the city you want to go, check-in and check-out dates, number of rooms, people traveling with you, and if you're traveling for work. And then you found the right room, and you need to share the information with someone else. Or maybe you want to save to look at it later. A good way to do that is to have all that information in the URL. It's insanely ugly, I know, but it's very useful. That prevents us to create an account or log into the system just to save the search, and also allows us to share the URL with someone else, and whoever gets it will see the same information. But for sensitive data, the best way is to store on the server side. So there are many ways to store browser data in Django. It can be a database, a file, a cache, and you can even use Django to store in your cookies, but encrypted. But Django's default implementation uses database. Actually, we have all the implementations in Django, but it comes by default installed with database. So the session model has three attributes: the session key, session data, and the expiry date. And it lives inside the session app. When you migrate for the first time, the table is created, but if for each time our session was updated, we hit the database, it wouldn't be very performatic. For that, Django has a session store object. There is an interface to access our session data without all the model database overhead, and it only saves once per request. The session store is a subclass of the session base, and there is an implementation for each session-based option Django provides to us, and it exposes some methods to handle the session data: create, delete, load, and save, which actually saves the data in the database. It's also a dict-like object, so you can deal with all the data using dictionary operations. You can use the session by instantiating the session store object directly using the session key you already have it, if you already have it, or not passing anything if you're creating a new one. But when you call create, it will create the session key. It will create a new session key, and store your session data in the database so you can access it later. And thanks to the session middleware, we can also use it on our views, already instantiated as a request attribute, like we saw earlier in this talk. But and when the session middleware is instantiated, it gets the session store based on what we defined on our settings. In our case, the database backend, and it saves it as an attribute. When the process request is called, it tries to get the session ID cookie to recover the session from the database. But if you are accessing the site for the first time, it will be none, and the new session store will be created. It's also thanks to the session middleware that after we change the session store object, it gets saved into the database. Let's look at the simplified code. So we get if our session was modified, accessed, or if it's empty. If it was modified, we get the session expire date. If we set that to none, the session will expire every time the browser closes. If not, it will going to be expired with the default value we have on our settings. The default is 2 weeks. So, but let's keep in mind that if the modified flag will only be true if we modify the session itself. So if we modify the session full here to bar or delete it, it will be modified. But if we modify an item of the session full, it won't be modified. So the session won't be saved again. So after saving the session, Django will set the cookie and send it to the user so we can use it again on the next request. So we now understand how login works, how Authenticate calls authentication backends, how authentication backends are implemented, and we understand sessions and how they work. Now we're going to see how those pieces are glued together and to provide the authentication feature in Django. And I'll talk about 4 different scenarios. So unauthenticated user with a session change, user authentication, and logout. So unauthenticated user. When our unauthenticated request arrives in our Django's project, the first middleware to be used is the session middleware. It tries to get the session, and since it's your first time in the site for a while, you don't have the session itself, so it creates a new session store object with a session key none. After that, we go to authentication middleware. It checks if you already have the session middleware installed, because it's required, and tries to assign a user to the request. Since you're not authenticated, it will be an instance of the anonymous user. This get function here actually calls the authentication backend get user. Oh, sorry, this get user function actually calls the authentication backend get user function that we defined on the beginning of the talk. So after that, we get to our view. It does its job, renders what needs to be rendered, and we go back to the middleware. So the session middleware verifies that if the session store was modified, if it was accessed, and if it's empty. Since we didn't change anything on our session, nothing will happen here. The cookie won't be set, and we don't have a session, actually. OK, so next case is unauthenticated user with a session change. So until we get to the view, it's basically the same. The session middleware tries to get the session. It can't, so it creates a new one. The auth middleware binds the anonymous user with the request, and then we get to the view. And in the view here, I'll change like a bit of the session just to see what happens. I'll add my name here, Renato. And the view wraps things up, returns what needs to be rendered, and we get back to the session middleware. So since we added something on our session, it is modified, it is accessed, and is not empty. So we will calculate the session expiry date, we'll save the session, and we will set the cookie in the response to be attached to the browser, as we can see here on our developer tools of choice. And now we have a session attached to an anonymous user. Let's see what happens when that user logs into the system. So again, we go over the session middleware, but now we have a session ID cookie. We get that and create a new instance of the session store with that key. We follow to the authentication middleware, and it will bind the anonymous user with the request. And we get to our login view. The login view is a form view, and like we saw on Felipe's talk, it will call the isValid function on the authentication form. That isValid function actually calls the errors property, which calls the full clean method, which will call the clean method. And that's where the magic happens. We get the username and password, and we call the authenticate function. Like we saw earlier, the authenticate function will iterate over the authentication backends. We only have one, so it will check the password, and it will return the user, the authenticated user to the authenticated function, which will return the user to the authentication form with the backend as an attribute. And the authentication form will be valid because we don't raise any errors here. The post receives true from the form is valid, so it will call the form valid function, which will perform the login itself. So it will verify that the user, it will verify if the user has the authenticated session key. It's hard. It doesn't, so it wasn't authenticated before. So it will cycle the key. This process actually gets the previous data we had on our session, creates a new key, and keep that data again. So when we log in and we have something on our sessions, it will be maintained. We store the session key and the backend in the session, and we attach the user to the request, and now we can go back to the session middleware. So in the session middleware, our request was accessed, modified, and is not empty. So we'll set the expire date, and we will save our session so the user can access through every request, and we set the session ID cookie. And then we're logged in. Now, to log out, so again, the request arrives in the session middleware, it gets the user session key, and it instantiates a new session store. The request then follows to the authentication middleware. And so it gets the user, and this function calls this getUser function here. It will get the user ID from the session. So we store the user primary key in the session key value of our session. It will retrieve that. It will get the backend from the session, actually, also. And for each of the authentication backends, it will load the backend and try to get the user. If we, not for each. For the backend we had defined, it will load the backend and get the user. And it will return the user to our previous auth middleware getUser function. So we get to our logout view with our user in the request. It will call the logout function, which will flush the session and replace the user back to, in the request to the anonymous user. And then we follow again to the session middleware. The session is now empty because we flushed it. Actually, flushes is a clean and a delete. So it erases the data from the session and deletes the key. So the session is now empty. And since we still have the session ID cookie on our cookies, it can be deleted, and we are finally logged out. Thanks.